"She'll come," the groom said with a smirk, lifting his champagne glass as laughter rippled through the private lounge beside the ballroom. "Trust me, people like her never miss a chance to see what they lost." A few of his friends chuckled. One woman shook her head and glanced toward the wedding invitation list spread across the table. "You actually invited your ex-wife?" she asked. "Why wouldn't I?" he replied. "I want everyone to see the difference between where I ended up and where she did." More laughter followed. Nobody defended her. Nobody questioned him. To them, she was already a cautionary tale, a woman who had been left behind while he climbed into a world of money, influence, and exclusive guest lists. What they didn't know was that the story they were celebrating was missing a few important pages. Across the room, someone joked about whether she would even be able to afford a decent dress. Another guest wondered if she would make up an excuse and stay home to avoid embarrassment. The groom smiled through all of it. He enjoyed hearing them talk. He enjoyed imagining her walking into the wedding and realizing exactly how far above her he had risen. 3 years earlier, she had walked out of his life carrying a cardboard box and a broken future. 3 years later, he expected her to return carrying regret. That was the entire point of the invitation. Humiliation. Public and unforgettable. He believed he had already won. He believed the woman he left behind was still trapped in the ruins of the life he destroyed. He was wrong, and that mistake was about to cost him more than his pride. Because the woman he planned to humiliate was quietly becoming the most important person in a room she had not even entered yet. He had no idea she would not be arriving alone. He had no idea that people far more powerful than his wedding guests already knew her name. Most of all, he had no idea that several of the people he was desperately trying to impress would soon care far more about her arrival than his ceremony. But for now, he sat comfortably at the center of attention, the king of his own carefully constructed story, the successful man, the admired man, the man everyone wanted a photograph with. It never occurred to him that stories built on arrogance rarely end the way their authors expect. 3 years earlier, when he filed for divorce, he hadn't shouted. He hadn't argued. The cruelty had been colder than that. He had simply informed her that she no longer fit into the future he wanted. The woman who had stood beside him during failures, debt, and uncertainty was suddenly treated like an obstacle. While he chased status and recognition, he erased the person who helped him reach it. And when she left, he never once looked back. At least, that was what he told himself. The truth was much uglier. Every success he celebrated had been built on foundations she helped pour. Every door he walked through had once seemed impossible until she convinced him not to quit. Yet when wealth arrived, gratitude disappeared. Now, sitting among guests who praised his success, he rewrote history in his own mind. He made himself the hero. He made her irrelevant. Unfortunately for him, reality was preparing its own version of events. Hundreds of miles away, a cream-colored invitation rested on a polished table. Her eyes lingered on the handwritten message at the bottom. It wasn't an invitation. It was a challenge disguised as one. A reminder of what he thought she had become. A reminder of how little he still thought of her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she folded the invitation and placed it back into the envelope. There was no anger in her expression. No tears. No desperation. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing something another person does not. Outside, a phone vibrated with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen. A short update. A confirmation. Something important had just been finalized. Her eyes narrowed slightly before the faintest smile touched her face. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted to ruin a wedding. But because she finally understood something he never would. Some victories announce themselves loudly. The most dangerous ones arrive in silence. And as the wedding day moved closer, the groom continued planning a humiliation he believed would entertain an entire ballroom. What he didn't realize was that the room he planned to control was already beginning to belong to someone else. The first sign of that shift would arrive sooner than anyone expected. Long before the private jets, magazine covers, and invitation-only galas, There had been a cramped apartment above a laundromat where the heating barely worked during the winter. Back then, nobody looked at him the way they did now. Nobody waited for his opinion. Nobody asked for his business card. He was just a man with a dream that seemed far bigger than his bank account. And through every setback, she stayed. When creditors called, she answered the phone and protected his pride. When investors rejected him, she sat across from him at a worn kitchen table and helped him prepare for the next meeting. When he wanted to quit, she refused to let him. More than once, she worked extra hours so the rent could be paid while he chased opportunities that never seemed to arrive. The people applauding him now had never seen those years. They had never seen him staring at spreadsheets at 2 in the morning while frustration pushed him to the edge. They had never seen her quietly placing a cup of coffee beside him before returning to her own work. They had never seen the sacrifices, the missed vacations, the postponed dreams, the promises that both of them believed would one day be worth it. At the time, he used to tell her that when success finally arrived, they would enjoy it together. He said they were a team. He said none of it would happen without her. She believed him. That was the tragedy. She believed every word. The first breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. One contract, one signature, one opportunity that suddenly changed everything. He ran into their apartment carrying the paperwork and laughing like a man who had just won the lottery. She remembered how tightly he hugged her. She remembered him saying, "We did it. Not I. We." For a while, it even seemed true. The money started coming in. The invitations followed. Better restaurants, better neighborhoods, better clothes, better connections. The life they had imagined was finally taking shape. But success changed the people around him before it changed him. New friends appeared. Influential people entered his orbit. Executives, investors, socialites. They laughed at his jokes, praised his ideas, invited him into rooms he once dreamed of entering. And slowly, almost invisibly, he began measuring his worth through their approval. The first warning sign seemed small. A dinner invitation arrived from a prominent business couple. He attended alone. He told her it was easier that way. The second warning sign came a few months later when she overheard someone asking why he never brought his wife to events. His answer was polite, calm, respectable, but something about it hurt. He spoke about her as if she belonged to a different chapter of his life, as if she were part of a story he was outgrowing. The distance grew month after month. Calls became shorter. Conversations became rarer. Excuses became easier. Then came the night she attended an event with him for the first time in nearly a year. The ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and expensive jewelry. She remembered the way conversations seemed to pause when she entered. Not because she had done anything wrong, because she did not look like the women they expected to see beside powerful men. The judgment was subtle. Quiet smiles, curious glances, conversations ending as she approached. Yet the moment that stayed with her was not what strangers did. It was what he failed to do. He saw it happening. He noticed every look, every dismissive expression, every whispered comment. And he said nothing. That silence hurt more than any insult could have. On the drive home, she waited for him to acknowledge it. He never did. Instead, he talked about future opportunities and important connections. Something inside her shifted that night. Not because she stopped loving him, because she realized he was becoming someone she no longer recognized. Years later, sitting alone with the wedding invitation resting beside her, she thought about that moment. Not with bitterness, not even with anger, just clarity. The man, who once said, "we," had spent years replacing that word with "me." Outside her window, the city lights reflected against the glass. Her phone vibrated again. Another message. Another confirmation. Another development connected to the quiet life she had built after everything fell apart. She read it once before locking the screen. Somewhere across the country, the groom was still telling his guests that she would arrive embarrassed. He was still expecting a broken woman carrying old wounds. What he did not know was that several people attending his wedding already recognized a name he had long since dismissed. And within days, One of those people would receive a phone call that would make the upcoming ceremony far more complicated than he could possibly imagine. The change did not happen overnight. That was what made it so dangerous. If he had suddenly become cruel, she might have fought back sooner. If he had openly admitted that success mattered more to him than loyalty, she might have left before her heart became entangled in the life they built together. Instead, the transformation arrived in small pieces. A canceled dinner here, a forgotten promise there, a meeting that somehow became more important than an anniversary, a phone call that could not wait, a weekend that belonged to investors instead of family. By the time she realized how far he had drifted, the man she married was already disappearing behind a carefully crafted image. The higher he climbed, the more obsessed he became with belonging to a world that had once ignored him. Every invitation felt like validation. Every handshake felt like a trophy. Every compliment from powerful people became something he chased with growing desperation. Unfortunately, that world demanded a price. It demanded appearances. It demanded status. It demanded that everyone fit a certain picture. And little by little, he began treating his wife like a flaw in that picture. One evening, they attended a charity gala attended by executives, politicians, and wealthy donors. She spent over an hour preparing because she knew how much the event mattered to him. Yet the moment they entered the ballroom, she felt the shift in atmosphere. Conversations paused. Eyes lingered. Smiles became strained. It was not open hostility. It was something colder. She watched people greet him warmly while barely acknowledging her presence. More than once, introductions ended with uncomfortable silence. One woman glanced at her before turning back to him and asking a question as if she were invisible. Another guest assumed she worked for the event staff. The humiliation stung, but what hurt even more was his response. Or rather, the lack of one. He laughed when others laughed. He smiled when they excluded her. He moved effortlessly through the room while she stood on the edges of conversations that seemed designed to keep her out. At one point, she caught him speaking with a group of investors. One of them asked if he planned to bring his wife to an upcoming retreat reserved for elite members of their circle. The man speaking looked directly at her before adding, "Although I suppose that depends on the image you are trying to build." Several people chuckled. The comment was subtle enough to avoid confrontation, but clear enough to leave no doubt about its meaning. She waited for him to defend her. Instead, he simply smiled and changed the subject. That moment stayed with her long after the evening ended. It was the first time she truly understood that he cared more about their approval than her dignity. The incidents multiplied after that. Invitations arrived addressed only to him. Photographs appeared online showing him surrounded by influential people while she remained absent. Entire weekends passed without meaningful conversation. Whenever she tried to discuss it, he insisted she was imagining things. He claimed she was being overly sensitive. He claimed nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. The worst part was not the exclusion. It was the growing realization that he saw it too. He simply no longer considered it important. Meanwhile, his reputation continued growing. New opportunities appeared every month. The world applauded his success. Articles praised his leadership. Business magazines called him one of the most promising entrepreneurs in the country. Every achievement made him more confident. Every achievement made him more certain that he could shape reality according to his own desires. He stopped asking for advice, stopped sharing concerns, stopped treating her like a partner. Eventually, he treated her like an obligation. Looking back years later, she would realize the marriage did not end on the day divorce papers arrived. It ended in dozens of small moments that nobody else noticed. It ended every time he chose status over loyalty. It ended every time he remained silent while others disrespected her. It ended every time he allowed strangers to determine her value. Yet even then, she never imagined how far he would go. Because while she struggled to save what remained of their relationship, another woman had already begun appearing beside him at private events. Not publicly, not officially, just enough to create whispers, just enough to make people talk. At first she dismissed the rumors. Then she started noticing familiar names appearing repeatedly in conversations. Familiar photographs. Familiar references. A pattern she could no longer ignore. And on the night she finally decided to confront him about it, she discovered something that made every warning sign from the past suddenly feel insignificant. For the first time, she realized she might already be too late. The answer arrived on a Tuesday evening. She had spent the entire afternoon rehearsing conversations in her head, searching for explanations that could make sense of the growing distance between them. Part of her still hoped she was wrong. Part of her still believed there had to be a misunderstanding. When he finally walked through the front door, she noticed something immediately. He was not surprised to see her waiting. It was almost as if he had expected this moment for weeks. She asked a simple question. She mentioned the rumors, the photographs, the whispers she could no longer ignore. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he exhaled and sat down across from her. There was no denial, no outrage, no attempt to defend himself. That silence told her everything before he even spoke. The room suddenly felt smaller. The future she had spent years building seemed to tremble beneath her feet. "I do not think this is working anymore," he finally said. The words landed with a coldness she had never heard from him before. She stared at him, waiting for something else. An apology, regret, emotion, anything. Instead, he looked almost relieved, as though he had been carrying a burden and was finally setting it down. She asked if there was someone else. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. That hesitation was enough. The truth no longer needed details. What hurt was not simply that another woman existed. What hurt was realizing he had emotionally left the marriage long before she noticed. Every late meeting, every canceled dinner, every unexplained absence suddenly fit together. The puzzle was complete, and the picture it formed was devastating. The following weeks felt unreal. Lawyers appeared. Documents arrived. Conversations became negotiations. The man who once promised to face every challenge beside her now treated their marriage like a business arrangement that had reached its expiration date. The kindness she remembered seemed gone, replaced by efficiency, replaced by distance, replaced by a determination to move on as quickly as possible. One afternoon, during a meeting that lasted less than an hour, she finally heard the sentence she would never forget. He leaned back in his chair and said, "You will be fine. You always land on your feet." To anyone else, the comment might have sounded reassuring. To her, it felt like dismissal. Years of sacrifice reduced to a convenient farewell. Years of loyalty summarized with a sentence designed to ease his conscience. He was already rewriting the story. In his version, they simply grew apart. In his version, nobody had been abandoned. In his version, nobody owed anyone anything. But reality was less comfortable. Reality remembered who stayed when everything was falling apart. Reality remembered who believed in him first. The divorce became final less than 4 months later. She walked out carrying little more than personal belongings and memories she no longer knew what to do with. The apartment felt unfamiliar after that. The silence felt heavier. Friends she thought would remain loyal slowly drifted toward him. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls became rare. People who once welcomed her suddenly seemed too busy. Success had given him influence. Influence had given him a version of the truth that many were willing to accept. For nearly a year, she watched doors close. Some closed quietly. Others slammed shut. One potential employer praised her qualifications before abruptly choosing another candidate. A former acquaintance promised to make introductions and never followed through. Even people she had once helped seemed hesitant to stand beside her now. It was as if failure had become contagious. Yet the most painful moment arrived several months later when she saw a photograph online. He stood smiling beside the woman from the rumors. They were attending an exclusive event surrounded by wealthy guests. Hundreds of comments praised them. Hundreds more celebrated them as a perfect match. Nobody mentioned the marriage left behind. Nobody mentioned the woman who had been erased from the picture. She stared at the image for a long time before finally closing her laptop. That night she cried harder than she had during the divorce itself. because the final illusion had disappeared. He was not coming back. He was not going to apologize. He was not going to recognize what she had done for him. If her life was going to improve, she would have to build it herself. No rescue was coming. No justice was coming. At least not yet. Years later, as she sat alone holding the wedding invitation that had arrived in her mailbox, she remembered that night with surprising clarity. She remembered the loneliness, the humiliation, the feeling of being forgotten. Then her phone lit up once again. This time the message contained only 6 words. The agreement has been officially approved. She read it twice. A slow breath escaped her lips. Somewhere else, preparations for the wedding continued. Guests finalized travel plans. Tables were assigned. Champagne was ordered. Everyone expected a celebration. None of them realized that the first crack in the groom's perfect future had already begun to form. The year after the divorce became the hardest year of her life. There were mornings when she stared at the ceiling of her small apartment and wondered how everything had unraveled so completely. The woman who had once attended charity galas and private business dinners now spent her days sending applications, making phone calls, and hearing the word no more often than she heard her own name. Every rejection felt personal. Every closed door felt like proof that the world had already decided her story was over. What made it worse was knowing that many of the people turning her away had once praised her when she stood beside her husband. Back then, they smiled. Back then, they remembered her name. Back then, they welcomed her into rooms that now seemed permanently closed. One former business contact promised to help her schedule interviews. Weeks passed and nothing happened. Another person agreed to meet for coffee, spent 40 minutes talking about loyalty and friendship, then never returned her calls. The pattern repeated so often that eventually she stopped expecting kindness. She learned to expect disappointment instead. Money became tight. She sold jewelry she rarely wore. She canceled subscriptions. She moved into a smaller apartment. She carefully tracked every dollar. More than once she lay awake calculating expenses and wondering how much longer she could continue. Yet somehow she always got up the next morning and tried again. The pain of failure was heavy, but the idea of surrender felt even worse. One afternoon she sat inside a crowded coffee shop reviewing job listings when she overheard 2 men discussing an opportunity they considered worthless. They spoke casually, almost dismissively, before leaving. Most people would have forgotten the conversation within minutes. She did not. Something about it stayed with her. She spent the next several days researching every detail she could find. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that everyone else was overlooking something important. For the first time in months, she felt genuine excitement. It was not certainty. It was not confidence. It was simply a possibility. A small crack of light breaking through a very long darkness. Unfortunately, possibilities do not pay bills. She needed resources she did not have. She needed connections she no longer possessed. She needed people willing to believe in her. Finding those people proved far more difficult than identifying the opportunity itself. Again and again she heard polite versions of the same answer. No. Some questioned her experience. Others questioned her timing. A few questioned whether she could succeed without the husband whose reputation had once opened doors for both of them. Those comments hurt more than she cared to admit. They reminded her how thoroughly her identity had been linked to someone who no longer wanted her in his life. Months passed. Savings continued shrinking. The opportunity seemed to move further away with every setback. Then came the day she nearly gave up. She still remembered standing outside a downtown office building after another disappointing meeting. Rain fell steadily across the sidewalk. Cars moved slowly through traffic. For several minutes, she simply stood there watching people hurry past. Nobody knew her story. Nobody cared. For the first time, quitting felt reasonable. Maybe everyone else had been right. Maybe she was chasing something impossible. Her phone rang before she could leave. The caller was someone she barely knew. An older professional she had met months earlier at a networking event. They exchanged only a few conversations since then. Yet somehow he remembered her. He asked how things were going. She answered honestly. To her surprise, he listened, really listened. When she finished speaking, he said something she would never forget. Most people stop right before things begin to change. It was not a guarantee. It was not a promise. But it was enough to keep her moving. Over the following weeks, that same person introduced her to another contact. Then another. Small opportunities appeared. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. Just enough momentum to prevent the dream from dying completely. Looking back, she would later realize that this period shaped her more than success ever could. It taught her patience. It taught her discipline. It taught her how to keep moving when nobody was watching. More importantly, it taught her who she was without anyone else's validation. Years later, as preparations for the wedding accelerated across the country, she thought about that season of her life often. The groom believed he understood her story because he remembered where she ended up after the divorce. What he did not understand was everything that happened afterward. He remembered her lowest point. He knew nothing about what came next. And somewhere inside a private conference room hundreds of miles away, a conversation was taking place between people he had never met. During that conversation, someone placed a folder on a polished table and quietly mentioned her name. The room immediately paid attention. The conversation inside that conference room lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences would stretch much further than anyone realized. The people gathered around the table were accustomed to evaluating opportunities worth millions of dollars. They rarely became excited. They rarely became impressed. Yet when her name appeared in the discussion, several of them immediately stopped checking their phones and started paying attention. One executive leaned forward. Another requested additional documents. A third asked a series of questions that nobody in the room seemed surprised to hear. The woman who had once struggled to pay rent was no longer being discussed as someone searching for a chance. She was being discussed as someone creating them. Of course, she was not present during that meeting. She never needed to be. That was one of the lessons she learned after the divorce. Real influence often worked quietly. It did not announce itself. It did not demand attention. It simply changed outcomes. Years earlier, after surviving her most difficult period, she had finally received the opportunity she almost gave up pursuing. It started small. One project, one calculated decision, one risk that many experienced professionals considered too uncertain. She studied every detail for weeks before moving forward. Others focused on short-term concerns. She focused on long-term value. Others chased immediate rewards. She looked for hidden potential. The decision frightened her. Failure would have been devastating. She invested time she could not afford to lose. She committed resources she could barely spare. For months, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. The project succeeded beyond expectations. Not because she was lucky, because she saw something everyone else missed. The success did not make her wealthy overnight. It did something more important. It gave her credibility. For the first time since the divorce, people stopped seeing her as someone trying to recover and started seeing her as someone worth listening to. New conversations followed. New introductions followed those conversations. Then came opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. Yet even as momentum grew, she remained cautious. She remembered too clearly how quickly fortunes could change. She remembered what arrogance had done to her former husband. She refused to become the same person. While others celebrated victories publicly, she focused on building quietly. While others sought attention, she concentrated on results. The discipline paid off. One successful decision led to another. One relationship led to another. Slowly, steadily, a reputation began forming. Not among social media followers. Not among gossip circles. Among people whose opinions actually moved industries. Ironically, many of them appreciated qualities her former husband had dismissed. Patience, preparation, consistency, integrity. The very traits he once viewed as weaknesses became the foundation of her success. Back in his world, however, a very different story was unfolding. Wedding preparations were entering their final stages. Every detail received careful attention. Seating arrangements, floral designs, guest lists, entertainment. The groom approached the event with the same confidence he brought to business negotiations. He expected everything to unfold according to plan. Why would he not? Most of his life had rewarded that assumption. During a dinner with friends several days before the ceremony, the conversation eventually turned toward his former wife. Someone asked whether he truly expected her to attend. He laughed. "She will come," he said confidently. Curiosity always wins. Another guest smirked and asked what he planned to say when she arrived. He lifted his glass. "Nothing. I do not need to say anything. The room will speak for itself." More laughter followed. Yet not everyone at the table seemed equally amused. One guest mentioned hearing an unfamiliar name during a recent financial conference. A woman. Someone. Apparently gaining unusual attention among influential investors. The comment lasted only a few seconds before the conversation moved on. Still, something strange happened. The groom paused. Not because he recognized the name. He did not. But because another person at the table immediately recognized it and reacted with visible interest. The moment passed quickly, almost too quickly to notice. Yet it planted a small seed of curiosity. Nothing more. Certainly not concern. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, she reviewed documents spread across a large table. Several people sat nearby discussing schedules and upcoming commitments. One of them reminded her about the wedding date. Another asked whether she was still planning to attend. For a brief moment, the room grew quiet. She looked toward the invitation resting near the edge of the table. Then she nodded once. "Yes," she said calmly. Nobody asked why. Nobody questioned the decision. Instead, one of the people in the room exchanged a glance with another and simply replied, "Then we should finalize the arrangements." Arrangements. Such an ordinary word. Yet if the groom had heard it, he might have started asking questions. Questions he was not prepared to hear answered. Because while he continued believing he understood the story, events were already moving beyond his control. And within the next few days, the first person connected to his wedding would discover that the woman he dismissed years ago had become someone far more significant than anyone in his circle could imagine. The first person connected to the wedding who noticed something unusual was not the groom. It was his event coordinator. 2 days before the ceremony, she received a routine phone call regarding security logistics. At first, nothing about the conversation seemed remarkable. High-profile weddings often required additional planning. Wealthy guests preferred privacy. Prominent executives occasionally requested special accommodations. Yet as the discussion continued, the coordinator found herself asking more questions than usual. Several names had been added to arrival schedules. Transportation details had been updated. Access points needed adjustment. None of the requests were unreasonable. What made them unusual was who appeared to be connected to them. After ending the call, she reviewed the information twice. Then a third time. Eventually, she reached out to a colleague who worked in corporate event management. "Have you heard of this person?" she asked casually. The response came almost immediately. "Of course." The coordinator frowned. "Why?" There was a brief pause before her colleague laughed softly. "You are joking, right?" By the time the conversation ended, the coordinator felt a strange sense of confusion. She still lacked most of the details. She still did not understand the full picture. But one thing was becoming increasingly obvious. Someone important was connected to the wedding in a way the groom clearly did not understand. Meanwhile, the groom remained focused on himself. During a final planning meeting, he reviewed seating charts and guest confirmations with visible satisfaction. Everything appeared perfect. The venue was stunning. The guest list was impressive. The celebration would be exactly the kind of social event people discussed for months afterward. More than once he imagined the moment his former wife walked through the doors and saw everything he had built without her. That image still brought a smile to his face. One friend jokingly asked whether he planned to reserve a special seat for her. "She can sit wherever she wants," he replied. "The view will be the same from every angle." Laughter followed. Yet not everyone joined in. One guest seemed distracted. Another appeared thoughtful. Finally, someone mentioned hearing her name again during a recent investment conference. This time, the reaction around the table was noticeably different. Several people immediately looked up. One executive even asked for clarification. The groom noticed. For the first time, curiosity replaced amusement. "Why does everyone keep reacting like that?" he asked. Nobody gave a direct answer. One person shrugged. Another changed the subject. A third simply smiled and said, "You probably have nothing to worry about." It should have reassured him. Instead, it left him strangely unsettled. The feeling disappeared quickly, but not completely. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a question had begun forming. Elsewhere, preparations continued on a very different scale. Inside a private office overlooking the city skyline, she sat across from several advisors reviewing schedules. The atmosphere was calm and professional. No one discussed revenge. No one discussed humiliation. Those subjects never interested her. What mattered now was responsibility, commitments, decisions. The life she spent years building after the divorce demanded her attention every single day. Yet despite everything on her calendar, the wedding remained there as well, quietly waiting. One advisor asked if she wanted additional arrangements adjusted. Another reviewed transportation options. A third mentioned security recommendations. She listened carefully before approving the final plan. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress. Simply practical decisions appropriate for someone whose time and obligations had become increasingly valuable. After the meeting ended, she remained alone in the conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see employees moving through hallways, discussing projects, preparing presentations, solving problems. Watching them reminded her of something important. None of this existed because someone rescued her. None of it appeared because luck suddenly arrived. Every step had been earned through years of persistence that nobody applauded at the time. Her phone vibrated. A new message appeared from someone attending the wedding. The note was brief. "Several influential guests have confirmed attendance." She read it once and placed the phone down. The message itself was not surprising. What mattered was who those guests were. Across the country, many of them were respected voices in industries the groom desperately wanted access to. People whose approval carried weight. People whose opinions shaped opportunities. People who already knew far more about her than he did. As evening settled over the city, the groom stood inside the ballroom for a final walkthrough. Crystal lights reflected across polished floors. Staff moved efficiently between tables. Everything looked exactly as he imagined. For a moment, he felt completely satisfied. Then his event coordinator approached with a question. It seemed innocent enough. "Just to confirm," she said carefully, "you are personally acquainted with all of your guests, correct?" He laughed. "Of course." She hesitated. Only briefly. Even the unexpected ones. The smile on his face faded just a little. What unexpected guests? The coordinator opened her tablet and turned the screen toward him. The moment he saw several names listed there, his confidence wavered for the first time in years. The names on the screen should not have meant anything to him. At least that was what he told himself during the drive home. Yet he found himself checking the list again later that night. Then once more before going to bed. Several guests had confirmed attendance only recently. On the surface, there was nothing unusual about that. Important people often made last-minute decisions. But what bothered him was the pattern. These were not random additions. They were individuals whose schedules were notoriously difficult to secure. People who rarely attended social events without a compelling reason. People whose presence instantly elevated the status of any room they entered. Why would they suddenly appear at his wedding? The question lingered longer than he wanted to admit. The next morning, he brought it up during breakfast with his fiancée. She laughed it off immediately. "You are overthinking it," she said. "Maybe they just heard about the event." He nodded. That explanation sounded reasonable enough. Yet something still felt off. Several hours later, he attended a final meeting regarding post-wedding networking opportunities. The conversation focused on future partnerships, business growth, and potential introductions. Halfway through the discussion, one attendee casually mentioned that a particular executive had recently declined invitations to 3 major industry gatherings. Then why is he coming here? Someone asked. The room fell quiet for a second. Nobody seemed to know. The groom forced a smile and changed the subject. But the question remained. Why indeed? Across the country, a very different conversation was taking place. Inside a private office, several members of her team reviewed the final schedule for the upcoming weekend. Transportation times were confirmed. Security routes were finalized. Communication plans were reviewed. Everything moved with quiet efficiency. No one treated the wedding as entertainment. No one discussed embarrassing anyone. To them, it was simply another event that required careful coordination. At one point, a younger associate glanced toward her and asked the question many had privately wondered about. Do you expect any problems? She considered the question before answering. No, she said calmly. I expect surprises. A few people smiled. They understood exactly what she meant. Not because they knew every detail, because they understood how often people underestimated her. Years earlier, those same assumptions had nearly destroyed her. Now they worked in her favor. Later that afternoon, she stepped into a conference room for another meeting. The discussion centered around several upcoming projects scheduled for the next quarter. Financial forecasts appeared on large screens. Market reports circulated around the table. Ideas moved back and forth with practiced confidence. Watching the discussion unfold reminded her of how far she had come. There was a time when she struggled to convince anyone to listen. Now entire teams waited for her opinion before making major decisions. Yet despite everything she had achieved, she felt remarkably calm. The wedding was approaching. The invitation still sat in her possession. But unlike the man who sent it, she no longer needed the past to validate her future. Meanwhile, wedding guests continued arriving throughout the city. Luxury hotels filled with visitors. Restaurants hosted private dinners. Conversations spread through cocktail lounges and executive suites. More than once, people mentioned certain high-profile attendees who were expected to appear. The speculation grew naturally. Why were so many influential individuals attending a wedding that was not particularly connected to their world? Nobody seemed to have a clear answer. The uncertainty only increased curiosity. That evening, the groom attended a private gathering organized by several close friends. The atmosphere was relaxed. Drinks flowed freely. Laughter echoed across the room. Yet once again, the conversation drifted toward the guest list. One man jokingly suggested that the wedding was beginning to look more like an executive summit than a marriage ceremony. Another laughed and asked if the groom had secretly become more important than everyone realized. Normally, he would have enjoyed the attention. This time he simply smiled. Then one of the guests said something that changed the mood. I spoke to someone this morning who recognized one of the names on your list. The groom looked up, and the man shrugged. Apparently that person never attends events without a reason. The room grew quieter. What reason? The groom asked. That is the strange part, the man replied. Nobody seems to know. For the first time, genuine uncertainty settled into the groom's mind. It was still small, still easy to ignore, but it was there. Later that night, long after the gathering ended, he stood alone on the balcony of his penthouse overlooking the city lights. Everything should have felt perfect. The wedding was less than 48 hours away. His future looked secure. His success seemed unquestionable. Yet he could not shake the feeling that something important was happening beyond his field of vision. Somewhere else, in a quiet office several states away, a final confirmation arrived. One of the most anticipated guests had officially accepted. The message was forwarded to her immediately. She read it once. Then she smiled, because she understood exactly what that acceptance would mean once the wedding began. And for the first time since sending the invitation, the balance of power started shifting in a way the groom could no longer see coming. The wedding day arrived beneath clear skies and the kind of perfect weather that made photographers smile. From the moment the first guest stepped onto the property, the atmosphere felt exactly as the groom had imagined. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Elegant music drifted through the air. Staff members moved with polished efficiency. Everywhere he looked, People were admiring the event, complimenting the venue, complimenting the guest list, complimenting the future he believed he had built entirely on his own. Yet even as congratulations surrounded him, a strange tension remained beneath the surface. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. More than once, he noticed guests checking their phones after receiving messages. More than once, he saw people glancing toward the main entrance before quickly returning to their conversations. Nobody seemed alarmed. Nobody seemed concerned. If anything, they appeared curious. The groom told himself it meant nothing. Still, the feeling from the previous days had not disappeared. It had only grown stronger. Inside the ballroom, conversations flowed easily. Crystal chandeliers illuminated hundreds of carefully arranged seats. The bride stood surrounded by friends while photographers captured every detail. Nearby, several prominent guests exchanged greetings. Some of them had traveled across the country to attend. Others rarely attended weddings at all. Their presence continued to puzzle people. One executive quietly asked another how he knew the groom. The second man smiled and admitted that he barely did. The answer surprised him. It surprised several others too. Yet before anyone could ask further questions, a staff member entered the room and whispered something to the event coordinator. Her expression changed immediately. Not dramatically, just enough to attract attention. She excused herself and headed toward the entrance. Outside, the first sign appeared. A black SUV turned onto the private drive leading toward the venue. Then another followed behind it. Then another. Within moments, several vehicles moved through the gates in a perfectly coordinated line. Security personnel stationed near the entrance exchanged quick glances. Guests standing near the windows began noticing the arrival as well. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Someone joked that a celebrity must be attending. Another guessed it was a politician. Nobody seemed certain. The vehicles continued forward before coming to a smooth stop near the entrance. The timing was impossible to ignore. Inside the ballroom, word spread rapidly. Guests moved closer to windows. Staff members tried to remain professional while discreetly observing the scene. The groom eventually noticed the shift in attention. He followed several people's gaze toward the front of the property. For a moment, confusion crossed his face. Then curiosity. Nothing more. Not yet. Outside, security personnel stepped from the vehicles first. Their movements were calm and organized. Not theatrical. Not aggressive. Simply professional. They positioned themselves naturally around the arrival area. The sight immediately changed the mood. People stopped joking. The assumptions about celebrities suddenly seemed less ridiculous. Several guests exchanged uncertain looks. Others began whispering. The event coordinator watched everything unfold with growing awareness. She remembered the unusual conversations from earlier in the week. She remembered the names on the guest list. She remembered the questions nobody could answer. Slowly, pieces of a larger puzzle began fitting together. Back inside, one of the influential guests approached the groom. "Did you arrange this?" he asked. The groom laughed nervously. "Arrange what?" The man pointed toward the entrance. "That." For the first time all day, the groom looked genuinely unsettled. Because he had not arranged it. He had no explanation. More importantly, he suddenly realized that many of the powerful guests he worked so hard to impress seemed far more interested in whoever was arriving than they were in the wedding itself. That realization landed heavily. Yet he still convinced himself it could not possibly matter. After all, this was his day, his event, his celebration. The attention would return soon enough. At least that was what he believed. Outside, one of the rear vehicle doors finally opened. A hush seemed to settle over the entrance area. Even those standing far away found themselves watching, waiting, anticipating. Yet before anyone stepped out, another luxury vehicle entered through the gates. Then another. The reaction intensified immediately. Guests began leaving conversations unfinished. Phones appeared. Curiosity spread like electricity through the crowd. Several individuals who had remained calm throughout the morning now looked visibly surprised. One prominent executive actually stood from his seat inside the ballroom and moved toward the entrance. Others followed. The bride noticed. The groom noticed. And neither of them understood why. Across the property, the balance of attention was shifting inch by inch, person by person, conversation by conversation. The wedding was no longer the most interesting thing happening at the venue. Then, as dozens of eyes fixed themselves on the line of black vehicles, the first figure finally emerged. The collective reaction was immediate. Not shock. Not yet. Something more powerful. Recognition. And in that single moment, several of the most influential people at the wedding started moving toward the entrance at the exact same time. The moment the first influential guest changed direction and walked toward the entrance, the atmosphere inside the ballroom shifted completely. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Waiters carrying trays slowed down. Even the musicians seemed distracted as heads turned toward the front of the venue. The groom watched in confusion as people he had spent years trying to impress suddenly became interested in something else. Then she stepped out. For a brief second, the entire property seemed to hold its breath. She was not wearing anything designed to attract attention through extravagance. She did not need to. Confidence accomplished what luxury often could not. She moved with calm assurance, surrounded by professionals who maintained a respectful distance while quietly guiding the flow of arrivals. The effect was immediate. Guests who had barely acknowledged one another all morning suddenly focused on a single person. The groom stared. Recognition came instantly. Of course it did. He knew her face. He remembered the woman he had left behind. What he did not recognize was the presence she carried now. This was not the uncertain woman who walked away from the divorce carrying heartbreak and unanswered questions. This was someone entirely different. Across the entrance area, several distinguished guests approached before she had even taken 10 steps. Their reaction stunned everyone watching. One executive extended his hand with genuine enthusiasm. Another greeted her warmly. A third smiled and thanked her for attending. None of them behaved like people acknowledging an ordinary guest. They behaved like people greeting someone they respected. Inside the ballroom, whispers exploded. "Who are they talking to?" someone asked. "Is that really his ex-wife?" Another whispered. "Why are they treating her like that?" The questions spread rapidly. The bride noticed. The groom noticed. The entire wedding noticed. Yet nobody had answers. The most unsettling part for the groom was not her arrival. It was watching powerful people react to her before he could even process what was happening. He expected awkwardness. He expected embarrassment. He expected her to feel out of place. Instead, the opposite seemed to be happening. Several guests who had barely spoken to him all morning now appeared eager to speak with her. The balance of attention continued shifting, one conversation at a time, one glance at a time, one introduction at a time. She remained composed through all of it. No arrogance, no smugness, no attempt to make anyone uncomfortable. That made the contrast even stronger. The groom suddenly became aware of how loudly he had celebrated his own success over the years. She seemed to possess something entirely different. A quiet confidence that required no explanation. Nearby, an older investor who rarely attended public events approached her with a broad smile. Their conversation lasted less than a minute, but dozens of people witnessed it. The reaction among guests was immediate. People recognized him. They knew how selective he was with his time. Seeing him seek her out raised even more questions. The groom felt an unfamiliar sensation settle into his chest. Not regret. Not yet. Something smaller. Something less comfortable. Uncertainty. For the first time, he could not predict what was happening. The event coordinator watched from a distance and finally understood why so many unusual requests had appeared during the week. The security arrangements. The transportation logistics. The guest confirmations. Suddenly everything made sense. She was not surprised anymore. The only surprising thing was that the groom seemed completely unaware of who he had invited. Across the ballroom, more influential guests continued arriving from different areas of the venue. Several changed direction the moment they spotted her. One even postponed a scheduled conversation in order to greet her first. The effect on the room became impossible to ignore. The wedding was still happening. The decorations were still beautiful. The music was still playing. Yet attention no longer belonged exclusively to the bride and groom. It had fractured, and every minute that passed seemed to strengthen that shift. The groom attempted to laugh it off when a friend asked whether he had expected this reaction. "People are curious," he replied. "That is all." But even he did not sound convinced. Because curiosity alone could not explain what he was seeing. Respect could. Influence could. Importance could. Those possibilities troubled him far more than curiosity ever would. Then came the moment that truly changed everything. One of the most recognizable guests at the entire event entered the ballroom. The room immediately noticed. Conversations paused. Cameras turned. Staff members straightened their posture. The individual looked around briefly before spotting her near the entrance. A smile appeared. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward her. The crowd watched in silence as he reached her side, shook her hand, and addressed her with a title that caused several people nearby to freeze. The groom heard it too, and for the first time all day, genuine fear began replacing confidence. The title echoed through the ballroom with surprising force. It was not shouted. It did not need to be. The respect behind it carried farther than volume ever could. Several nearby guests immediately turned toward the speaker. Others froze where they stood. The groom felt his stomach tighten as he watched one of the most influential figures in the room greet his former wife with unmistakable familiarity. Not polite recognition, not casual acquaintance, genuine professional respect. The conversation that followed lasted less than a minute, yet every second seemed to raise more questions than answers. People leaned closer. Whispers spread. Names were exchanged. References were made to projects, partnerships, and decisions that clearly existed far beyond the groom's understanding. Then came the first real shock. A guest standing nearby quietly explained to another who she had become. The information moved through the crowd almost instantly. At first, many refused to believe it. They assumed there had been a misunderstanding. Some thought there must be another person with the same name. Others checked their phones. A few searched articles and company reports. The results only deepened the disbelief. Suddenly, the reactions from the previous week made sense. The unusual guest list. The security arrangements. The excitement surrounding her arrival. The respect shown by executives who rarely admired anyone. None of it had been random. None of it had been accidental. The woman many expected to arrive carrying humiliation had arrived carrying influence. The groom felt as though the room was shifting beneath his feet. For years he had carefully constructed a story about the divorce. A story where he moved forward while she remained behind. A story where success proved he made the correct decision. A story where he was the winner. Now, piece by piece, that story was collapsing in front of witnesses. Across the ballroom, conversations no longer centered on the wedding. They centered on her. Guests discussed ventures she helped build, organizations she advised, decisions she made that affected industries larger than anything the groom had ever touched. More than once he overheard someone speaking about her achievements with admiration. Every word felt impossible. Every word felt threatening. Because the person they described did not resemble the image he carried in his mind. He remembered the woman who struggled after the divorce. The woman who walked away alone. The woman he assumed never recovered. He did not know the woman standing here now. A group of executives approached her one after another. Each interaction seemed to elevate the atmosphere around her even further. Nobody appeared impressed by wealth alone. What impressed them was credibility, influence, results, the kind of reputation that could not be purchased through appearances. Nearby, several guests who had laughed about her before the wedding suddenly avoided discussing those comments altogether. Others looked embarrassed. A few seemed genuinely ashamed. The social tide had turned so completely that people were quietly rewriting their opinions in real time. Then another revelation surfaced. One respected investor casually mentioned that her company had recently completed a major transaction that many experts considered one of the most significant developments of the year. The reaction was immediate. Several guests stared at her. Others exchanged stunned looks. The groom heard the details and felt his confidence crack further. Not because of the money involved, because he understood what it represented. Competence, vision, leadership, everything he once believed she could never achieve without him. He suddenly remembered old conversations from years earlier. Ideas she shared, advice she offered, insights he dismissed. Memories he had not thought about in a very long time returned with uncomfortable clarity. For the first time, a painful possibility entered his mind. What if he had been wrong? Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. Across the room, she remained calm. She did not boast. She did not seek attention. She did not mention the past. Ironically, that made her presence even more powerful. The crowd supplied the admiration without her asking for it. The respect appeared naturally because it had already been earned long before this day. Meanwhile, the groom found himself standing among decorations, flowers, and carefully planned details that suddenly felt far less important than they had an hour earlier. His wedding still mattered, yet it was no longer controlling the room. The spotlight had moved, and everyone knew it. Then came the moment that truly shattered whatever confidence remained. A prominent guest approached the groom directly and offered congratulations. For a brief second, relief appeared on his face. Finally, attention had returned to him. But the guest's next words erased that comfort immediately. "I had no idea you were once married to her," the man said with genuine amazement. "Do you realize how extraordinary that woman is?" The groom opened his mouth to answer. Nothing came out, because for the first time since the divorce, he was no longer wondering who she had become. He was wondering how he ever convinced himself she was not enough. The question followed him long after the conversation ended. "Do you realize how extraordinary that woman is?" The words repeated in his mind with relentless precision. Hours earlier, he would have dismissed them. Hours earlier, he would have smiled politely and changed the subject. Now he could not, because every new conversation seemed to confirm the same uncomfortable truth. The woman he once viewed as an obstacle had become someone people admired without hesitation. The woman he assumed needed him had built a life powerful enough to command respect from individuals he still struggled to impress. Across the ballroom, guests continued gravitating toward her. Some approached with questions. Others arrived simply to greet her. Several waited patiently for an opportunity to speak. The pattern was impossible to ignore. The groom watched as one prominent executive postponed a scheduled meeting in order to spend a few minutes in conversation with her. He watched another guest introduce family members who seemed genuinely excited to meet her. Every interaction deepened the feeling growing inside him. The feeling was no longer uncertainty. It had evolved into something far more painful. Regret. Not because she had become successful, because he suddenly understood what he lost before any of that success existed. For years, he convinced himself that he had outgrown the marriage. He told himself that ambition required difficult choices. He told himself that moving forward demanded sacrifice. Standing there now, those justifications felt hollow. The qualities people admired in her were the same qualities she possessed during their marriage. The intelligence, the patience, the resilience, the loyalty. None of it was new. The only difference was that other people had learned to recognize the value he ignored. Meanwhile, the social dynamics inside the ballroom continued shifting. Guests who once focused entirely on the bride and groom now divided their attention elsewhere. Conversations repeatedly returned to her achievements. Stories circulated about business decisions she made, projects she led, opportunities she created. Every revelation added another layer to a reality he never anticipated. The bride noticed the change as well. Although she tried to maintain composure, frustration occasionally surfaced through forced smiles and distracted glances. It was not difficult to understand why. Weddings are supposed to celebrate beginnings. Yet somehow the most discussed person at the event was someone who did not belong to the ceremony itself. The irony was impossible to escape. The groom had invited her expecting validation. Instead, her presence exposed every assumption he carried about success, status, and worth. Eventually, he found himself moving through the crowd almost automatically, smiling when necessary, greeting guests when required, performing the role everyone expected. Inside, however, something had changed. The confidence that once defined him felt fragile. He no longer viewed the room as proof of victory. He viewed it as evidence of everything he misunderstood. Near the edge of the ballroom, he finally saw an opening. For the first time all day, she stood alone. The surrounding crowd had temporarily dispersed. Several conversations ended. A few guests moved elsewhere. The moment felt rare, unexpected. Before he could reconsider, he walked toward her. She noticed him approaching, but showed no surprise. No discomfort. No anger. Only calm. The same calm that had unsettled him from the moment she arrived. For several seconds neither spoke. The noise of the wedding continued around them, while an entirely different conversation waited to begin. "You look well," he finally said. The words sounded inadequate the moment they left his mouth. She offered a polite smile. "Thank you." Silence followed again. He searched for something meaningful to say. An explanation. An apology. A question. None seemed sufficient. "I did not know," he admitted quietly. She studied him for a moment. "No," she replied gently. "You did not." There was no bitterness in her voice. Somehow that hurt even more, because bitterness would have meant she still carried the weight of the past. Instead, she sounded like someone who had already set it down. The realization struck him harder than any accusation could have. She no longer needed anything from him. Not approval, not recognition, not regret. The chapter he spent years trying to rewrite had already closed for her. Yet for him, it was only now beginning to make sense. He lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at her. "I made mistakes," he said. It was the closest thing to an apology he managed. She nodded. "We all do." Again, no anger, no revenge, no attempt to make him suffer. The grace of that response exposed the full weight of his failure. Because in that moment he finally understood something devastating. The greatest consequence of losing her was not watching her succeed without him. It was realizing she would have stood beside him through anything if he had simply valued her when it mattered. Before he could say anything else, several guests approached once more. The brief conversation ended naturally. She exchanged polite farewells and turned her attention elsewhere. He remained where he was, watching as the crowd welcomed her back into their conversations. For the first time since the wedding began, he understood a truth he could no longer avoid. He had spent years believing he was the prize. Now he knew the opposite was true. And as he stood alone among hundreds of guests, he realized there was one final lesson still waiting for him before the night ended. The final lesson arrived quietly. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public argument, no grand speech designed to embarrass anyone. In the end, reality did something far more powerful. It simply revealed itself. The reception continued around them as guests moved between conversations, dinner tables, and the dance floor. Music filled the ballroom. Laughter drifted through the air. On the surface, the celebration remained beautiful. Yet for the groom, everything looked different now. He watched the evening unfold through entirely new eyes. Every compliment he received felt strangely hollow. Every congratulations seemed incomplete, because no matter where he turned, he could not escape the truth he finally understood. The woman he once believed would always be there had become someone extraordinary without him. More importantly, she had become someone who no longer needed him. Across the ballroom, she continued speaking with guests who genuinely valued her presence. Some discussed business. Others shared stories. A few simply enjoyed her company. There was something remarkable about watching it happen. Nobody seemed interested in her because of wealth alone. They respected her because of who she was, because of what she built, because of how she carried herself. The admiration surrounding her felt earned rather than manufactured. And that difference mattered. The groom spent years chasing status. She spent years building substance. Tonight, the results of those choices stood side by side for everyone to see. As the evening progressed, several guests approached him with variations of the same question. How had he known her? How long had they been together? What was she like before her success became widely recognized? At first he answered politely. Then the questions became harder, because every answer reminded him of opportunities he wasted. Every memory highlighted moments when he chose ambition over loyalty. Eventually, he stopped volunteering details altogether. Not because he was angry, because regret had become exhausting. Meanwhile, she seemed completely at peace. There was no sign of revenge in her behavior, no attempt to enjoy his discomfort, no effort to remind anyone of the past. Ironically, that grace created the strongest contrast of all. People expected resentment after what happened. Instead, they witnessed dignity. They expected bitterness. Instead, they saw confidence. The absence of hostility made her success feel even more powerful. Late in the evening, as guests began preparing to leave, several people gathered near the entrance to say goodbye. One by one, they thanked her for attending. One by one, they expressed hopes of seeing her again soon. The respect was impossible to miss. Nearby, the groom watched quietly. Not hidden, not excluded, simply observing a reality he could no longer deny. At one point, their eyes met across the room. For a brief moment, years of history existed between them. The struggles, the sacrifices, the mistakes, the heartbreak, everything that brought them to this night. Then she offered him a small smile. It was not the smile of someone seeking victory. It was the smile of someone who had finally found peace. And in that instant, he understood the difference between them. He spent years trying to prove he had won. She spent years rebuilding her life. Only one of those goals led to happiness. As the evening came to an end, she made her way toward the exit. Several members of her team waited nearby. Vehicles were already prepared. The same calm professionalism that accompanied her arrival remained present now. Yet the atmosphere felt different. Lighter. Complete. The story that began with humiliation had reached its natural conclusion. Not because someone lost, because someone healed. Before stepping outside, she paused briefly and looked back across the ballroom one final time. The room no longer represented pain. It no longer represented betrayal. It no longer represented the worst chapter of her life. It was simply a room, a place, a moment. The past no longer had power over her. Then she turned and walked away. Outside, the night air felt cool and peaceful. The city lights shimmered in the distance. Doors opened. Goodbyes were exchanged. Within moments, the vehicles departed smoothly into the evening. Back inside, guests gradually returned to their conversations. The celebration continued. Yet something important had changed. The groom stood near the entrance watching the taillights disappear. For years he believed success meant gaining more. More recognition, more influence, more admiration. Tonight taught him a different lesson. Sometimes the greatest loss is realizing the value of something only after it is gone forever. He remained there for a long moment, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. Not because he expected her to return. He knew she would not. That chapter had ended. The opportunity had passed. The future belonged to different paths now. And perhaps that was the final justice in all of it. She did not need revenge. She did not need validation. She did not need anyone to tell her she mattered. The life she built had already answered every question that once kept her awake at night. As for him, he would move forward carrying a truth far heavier than humiliation. The knowledge that the person he underestimated became everything he once hoped to be. And the knowledge that he only understood her worth after losing the chance to stand beside her forever.